The story you are about to hear seems impossible at first glance. 80 armored vehicles against 1,200. A ratio of 1 to 15. Numbers that defy all conventional military logic. But this is not just a story about machines of war. It is a narrative about preparation, technology, strategy, and the human factor that transforms metal and circuits into decisive instruments of nations' destinies. We are talking about an event that shook the foundations of modern military thinking. A moment when quantity met quality under conditions that seemed overwhelmingly to favor the numerically superior side. And at the center of this extraordinary story are 80 Leopard tanks that had undergone a modernization process so profound that it transformed them into something completely different from their original versions. To understand the magnitude of what happened in those fields of Eastern Europe, we first need to go back in time and understand the context that made this confrontation not only possible but inevitable. We need to understand the military doctrines that guided both sides, the technologies that were at stake, and the people who made decisions under extreme pressure. If you're enjoying this story, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and comment below the time you're watching this video. Your interaction helps this content reach more people interested in military history. The Cold War was never truly cold in the minds of military planners. While politicians spoke of détente and peaceful coexistence, generals on both sides of the Iron Curtain studied maps, calculated invasion routes, and prepared their forces for a conflict that everyone hoped would never come, but that no one could ignore. Central Europe was the board where this confrontation would be disputed should peace fail. The Soviet doctrine of armored warfare was the product of decades of experience and military theorization. From the vast steppes where German and Soviet tanks faced each other during World War II, Moscow strategists developed a military philosophy based on mass, speed, and depth. It was not simply about outnumbering the enemy, although that was important. It was about creating successive waves of armored forces that would penetrate deeply into enemy territory, surrounding and isolating defending units before they could react effectively. Soviet tanks were designed with this philosophy in mind. They were not the most sophisticated machines from a technological standpoint, but they were robust, reliable, and above all, produced in massive quantities. The Soviet Union could manufacture tanks in numbers that Western nations simply could not match. And this industrial capacity was, in itself, a strategic weapon. An individual Soviet tank might be inferior to its Western equivalent in various technical aspects, but when you have 15 for each one of the adversaries, technical advantages begin to seem less relevant. On the other side, the nations of Western Europe and their allies developed a different approach. Knowing they could never compete in terms of pure numbers, they bet on quality, technology, and superior preparation. Each Western tank needed to be capable of facing multiple adversaries. Each crew needed to be trained to a level of excellence that would compensate for numerical inferiority. And each weapon system needed to incorporate the most advanced technologies available. The Leopard, produced in West Germany, perfectly represented this philosophy. From its first version, it was designed to be an exceptional platform. Superior mobility, effective armor, and a cannon capable of penetrating practically any armor known at the time. But technology does not remain static, especially in an era of rapid innovation. As the years passed, the Soviets improved their own tanks, developed new anti-tank weapons, and refined their tactics. What was superior yesterday could be merely adequate tomorrow. It was in this context that the deep modernization program was born that would transform 80 Leopards into something truly special. It was not about small adjustments or incremental improvements. It was a fundamental reconstruction of these vehicles' capabilities. New sighting systems that incorporated state-of-the-art thermal technology. Enhanced armor with composite materials that offered dramatically superior protection against kinetic projectiles and shape-charge anti-tank warheads. Communication systems that allowed real-time coordination between vehicles. New, more effective and precise munitions. Improved propulsion systems that increased the already impressive mobility of these tanks. But perhaps most important was the integration of advanced electronic systems that allowed these modernized Leopards to operate as a coordinated network. Each tank could share target information with the others instantly. A commander could see through the sensors of his entire unit, creating a situational awareness that was simply impossible with previous technologies. In darkness or through smoke, These thermal systems could detect the heat signature of a tank engine at distances that seemed impossible. The German engineers involved in this modernization program knew they were creating something exceptional. Tests showed capabilities that exceeded all expectations. But tests in controlled fields are one thing. The real battlefield, with all its chaos, unpredictability, and extreme pressure, is something completely different. No one really knew how these 80 modernized tanks would fare in a real confrontation against numerically much superior forces. The crews selected to operate these modernized Leopards underwent months of intensive training. It was not enough to understand the new systems technically. It was necessary to develop an intuition, a capacity to react instantly in combat situations without having to think consciously about each action. Simulators were run repeatedly, presenting increasingly difficult scenarios. Field exercises tested not only individual skills but the ability of crews to work together as a coordinated force. The selection of commanders was particularly careful. These men needed to be able to think strategically even under intense fire. They needed to understand not just how to fight with their tanks but how to use terrain, how to anticipate enemy movements, and how to make quick decisions that could mean the difference between success and failure. Each commander underwent rigorous psychological evaluations. The pressure of commanding a tank in combat is immense. The pressure of commanding when you are numerically outnumbered 15-1 is almost unbearable. Meanwhile, on the other side of the line that divided Europe, Soviet forces maintained their doctrine of numerical superiority. 1,200 tanks represented a massive armored force by any standard. Organized in formations that had been refined over decades, this force was designed to advance in successive waves. The first wave would absorb defensive fire, identify enemy positions, and create breaches. Subsequent waves would exploit these breaches, penetrating deeply and surrounding defending forces. It was a doctrine that had proven its effectiveness countless times in exercises and studies. Numbers simply overwhelmed the opposition. Even if each defending tank managed to neutralize several attackers, it would eventually be overcome by the sheer quantity of targets. And the Soviets were willing to accept substantial losses if it meant achieving their operational objectives. This willingness to trade losses for territory was an integral part of their military philosophy. The geography of Eastern Europe favored armored operations. Vast plains allowed large-scale maneuvers. There were urban areas that needed to be considered, but Soviet doctrine emphasized bypassing strong resistance points whenever possible, isolating them and letting follow-on forces deal with them. Speed was essential. The faster you advanced, the less time the enemy would have to organize effective defenses. The planners who organized the defense faced extremely difficult decisions. With only 80 modernized tanks available, each decision about positioning was critical. They could not be everywhere. They needed to choose where to make their defensive stand. The terrain was studied meticulously. Each elevation, each tree line, each possible avenue of advance was mapped and analyzed. Where would the Leopards have the best field of vision? Where could they use their superior mobility to reposition quickly? Where could they force attackers to cluster in restricted areas? The final decision was to establish a defense in depth taking advantage of specific geographical features. It would not be a traditional defensive line, but a series of mutually supporting positions. The tanks would not remain static waiting for the enemy to come to them. They would use their superior mobility to attack, reposition, attack again. The idea was to create confusion in attacking formations, disrupt their coordination, and force them to disperse their forces trying to deal with threats coming from multiple directions. The German advisors who accompanied these preparations were nervous. They had supervised the modernization of these Leopards. They knew their technical capabilities intimately, but theory is always cleaner than practice, and the stakes could not be higher. If this defense failed, there would be no second chance. Soviet forces would sweep the area and continue their advance. But if it succeeded, it would prove that advanced technology combined with superior tactics could really overcome massive numerical advantages. When the confrontation finally began, it was with the force of a storm. The first Soviet wave advanced on a broad front, exactly as predicted by doctrine. Hundreds of tanks moving in coordinated formations, supported by mechanized infantry and artillery. The noise was deafening. The ground trembled with the weight of so many armored vehicles in motion. It seemed like an irresistible force, a tide of steel that would sweep away anything in its path. The Leopard crews waited with a calm that belied the natural tension of the situation. Months of training took over. Thermal systems detected Soviet tanks long before they were visible to the naked eye. Fire control computers calculated solutions instantly. And when the order was given, the first shots were fired at distances that left the attackers completely surprised. What the Soviets did not expect was the exceptional precision of these modernized Leopards. Tanks began to be neutralized before their crews even saw where the shots were coming from. Thermal technology allowed the Leopards to engage targets through smoke and dust that blinded conventional optical systems. And when the Soviets tried to return fire, they discovered that the enhanced armor of the Leopards deflected projectiles that would have incapacitated previous generations of tanks. The first Soviet wave, confident in its numerical superiority, continued advancing even while losing vehicles. This was the doctrine, after all. Initial losses were expected and acceptable. But the loss rate was far above what was predicted. And the Leopards were not where initial reconnaissance had suggested. Using their superior mobility, they constantly repositioned, attacking from unexpected angles and then disappearing before they could be effectively counterattacked. Soviet commanders began to adjust their tactics. They tried to concentrate forces to crush individual Leopard positions through sheer quantity of fire. But the advanced communication network allowed the Leopards to coordinate their actions perfectly. When a position was threatened by concentration of enemy forces, other Leopards attacked the flanks of this concentration, forcing it to disperse or risk being neutralized. What followed was an intense confrontation that lasted hours. The modernized Leopards demonstrated all the capabilities their creators had designed. The exceptional precision of their modernized cannons meant that practically every shot resulted in an enemy tank neutralized or incapacitated. The sighting systems allowed engaging multiple targets in rapid succession. A single well-trained crew in a modernized Leopard could neutralize several Soviet tanks in a matter of minutes. But this was not just a demonstration of technological superiority. The Leopard crews were fighting with a tactical intelligence that transformed their technical advantages into battlefield dominance. They understood they could not simply stand still and shoot. They needed to remain unpredictable, maintain the initiative, force the Soviets to react instead of executing their own plan. A particularly critical moment came when a Soviet formation managed to flank one of the Leopard positions. For brief moments, it seemed the tide might turn. Soviet tanks were in position to engage the Leopards from a direction not protected by the strongest armor. But the instantaneous communication network allowed a coordinated response. Other Leopards quickly repositioned, attacking this flanking formation from its own flank. Within minutes, the threat was neutralized, but it cost the Leopards precious ammunition and revealed positions that had been secret until that moment. The German advisors observing the battle through real-time reports were simultaneously amazed and horrified. Amazed because their modernized Leopards were performing even better than the most optimistic projections. Horrified because they could see how close to the limit the crews were operating. Each minute of intense combat consumed not only ammunition but also the mental and physical energy of the crews. And the Soviets, despite their growing losses, kept coming. The second wave of Soviet attack was executed with tactical adjustments. Soviet commanders had learned from the mistakes of the first wave. They now knew they were facing not common Leopards, but dramatically improved versions. Their formations became more dispersed to reduce the effectiveness of concentrated fire. They began using smoke more aggressively, trying to blind the Leopard sighting systems, not knowing that thermal technology made these smoke screens practically useless. But even with tactical adjustments, the technological disparity was simply too great. The Leopards continued detecting and engaging targets at distances where Soviet tanks could not respond effectively. And when the Soviets managed to get close enough to fire, they discovered that their munitions, although effective against previous generations of armor, had significant difficulty penetrating the enhanced composite armor of the modernized Leopards. As the hours passed, the battlefield showed the signs of intense confrontation. Hundreds of incapacitated or abandoned Soviet tanks dotted the landscape. Some were severely damaged, while others were immobile but apparently intact, their crews having evacuated. Smoke from numerous damaged vehicles created a dense fog that hung over everything. For the Leopard crews, exhaustion was becoming a critical factor. Tank combat is physically and mentally draining. The heat inside the vehicle, the constant noise, the smell of gunpowder and diesel, the constant tension. Some crews had been in continuous combat for more than 6 hours. Their movements were beginning to become less precise, their decisions taking fractions of a second longer. In combat, these fractions of a second can be critical. But the Soviets were in even worse shape. Their losses were overwhelming. Entire formations had been compromised. Communication between units was breaking down. Commanders were out of action or isolated. The carefully elaborated operational plan was in tatters. And above all, there was the psychological factor. Soviet crews had entered the battle confident in their numerical superiority. Now they were seeing their comrades being systematically neutralized by an enemy that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at the same time. The third wave of Soviet attack was noticeably less enthusiastic than the previous ones. Doctrine demanded they continue advancing, but the reality of the battlefield was eroding morale. Crews that had seen much of their formation compromised do not advance with the same determination as fresh forces. And the Leopards, despite their own exhaustion, continued inflicting significant losses. A turning point came when Soviet commanders attempted a large-scale encirclement maneuver. If they could not overcome the Leopards through frontal attack, they would try to surround them and neutralize them through concentrated fire from multiple directions. It was a reasonable plan in theory. In practice, it required precise coordination between multiple formations moving through difficult terrain while under constant fire. The Leopards detected the encirclement movement before it could be completed. Using their superior mobility, they executed a countermaneuver that transformed the attempted encirclement into a trap for the Soviets themselves. The formations that should have been surrounding the Leopards suddenly found themselves attacked from their flanks and rear. In less than 30 minutes, this third wave was effectively neutralized as an effective combat force. It was after this setback that Soviet commanders finally began to consider the unthinkable. They had begun the operation with 1,200 tanks. Now, after hours of intense combat, their losses were so massive that their numerical superiority had essentially evaporated. And it was not just a question of numbers. The combat capability of their remaining forces was severely degraded. Crews were demoralized. Coordination between units had collapsed. The chain of command was in pieces. On the Leopard side, the situation was not exactly comfortable, but it was infinitely better. They had lost only a few vehicles to enemy fire, and none had been totally incapacitated. Some Leopards had been damaged and withdrawn from action, but the majority were still operational. And most importantly, their ability to fight in a coordinated and effective manner remained intact. The German advisors who had accompanied the development and deployment of these modernized Leopards were in a state of shock. Not because the defense had failed, but because it had been so spectacularly successful. The most optimistic projections had suggested that 80 modernized Leopards could stop a force several times larger, but no one had really expected they could inflict such severe losses against a force 15 times larger. The lessons of this battle were profound and multifaceted. First, it became clear that advanced technology, when combined with superbly trained crews and intelligent tactics, could really overcome massive numerical advantages. But there were important nuances here. It was not just the technology alone, nor was it just the training, nor was it just the tactics. It was the synergistic combination of all these factors that had produced such a one-sided result. The enhanced armor of the modernized Leopards had proven critical. It allowed them to remain in combat even when hit, giving their crews multiple opportunities to engage the enemy. But armor alone would not have been sufficient without the advanced sighting systems that allowed detecting and engaging targets at extreme distances. And these sighting systems would not have been so effective without the modernized ammunition that could penetrate practically any known armor. The superior mobility of the Leopards had allowed tactics that would be impossible with slower or less agile platforms. The ability to reposition quickly, to attack from unexpected directions, to escape before the enemy could concentrate effective fire, All this depended on a propulsion system that had been significantly improved during modernization. But perhaps the most important factor was the communication and coordination systems. The ability of each Leopard to know instantly where all the others were, to share target information, to coordinate maneuvers in real time, this transformed 80 individual tanks into a single coherent and effective combat force. The Soviets had faced not 80 separate adversaries, but essentially a single organism with 80 weapons systems. The training of the crews could not be underestimated. Months of intensive preparation had created a competence that manifested in every aspect of their performance. The speed with which they could acquire targets, the precision of their shots, the fluidity of their maneuvers, all this was the product of countless hours of practice and refinement. In combat situations, when decisions need to be made in fractions of a second, superior training translates directly into survival advantage and effectiveness. Leadership had also been crucial. The Leopard commanders had demonstrated an exceptional ability to think tactically even under extreme pressure. They had anticipated enemy movements, exploited opportunities when they arose, and avoided traps that could have been disastrous. This quality of leadership does not arise by accident. It is cultivated through careful selection, rigorous training, and experience. For the Soviets, this battle was a brutal awakening. Their doctrine of numerical superiority, which had served well for decades, had found its limits. Against a technologically inferior adversary, massive waves of tanks might still be effective. But against forces equipped with significantly superior technology and well-trained, numbers alone were not enough. The losses they had suffered were not just material, but also psychological and doctrinal. The strategic implications of this battle reverberated far beyond the immediate battlefield. Military planners around the world studied what had happened. The inevitable conclusion was that armored warfare was entering a new era. The era where a few exceptionally capable vehicles, operated by superiorly trained crews, could dominate much larger forces equipped with inferior technology. This did not mean that numbers no longer mattered. Even the most advanced Leopards have limits. Ammunition runs out. Mechanical systems fail. Crews tire. Against even more numerous adversaries, or in prolonged campaigns, even technologically superior forces can be worn down. But what this battle demonstrated was that the military equation had fundamentally changed. Quality had reached a point where it could overcome quantity in ways that were previously considered impossible. The engineers who had designed the Leopard modernizations found complete validation of their work. Every system they had installed, every improvement they had made, had proven its value in actual combat conditions. But they also understood that technology never stops. What was revolutionary today would be standard tomorrow and obsolete the day after. The arms race would continue, with each side seeking the next technological advantage. For the crews who had fought in these modernized Leopards, the experience was transformative. They had faced odds that seemed impossible and prevailed. But there was no superficial triumphalism. They had seen extremely difficult situations. They had experienced the intensity of being under fire. They knew how close to different outcomes they had been at various moments. Victory did not erase those realities. The battle also raised profound ethical and strategic questions. How much of a technological advantage was necessary to justify facing a numerically superior adversary? How do you balance the safety of your own forces against the risks of catastrophic defeat? These are not questions with simple answers, and military commanders continue grappling with them to this day. One frequently overlooked aspect of this story is the role of logistical planning. The modernized Leopards could have all the technology in the world, but without ammunition, fuel, and spare parts, they would be useless. The operation of keeping 80 tanks operational in intense combat conditions required an impressive logistical effort. Fuel needed to be transported to forward positions. Ammunition had to be available in sufficient quantities. Field repairs needed to be executed quickly to return damaged vehicles to action. Maintenance teams worked tirelessly throughout the battle. While the crews fought, mechanics and technicians worked frantically to keep systems running. Small repairs were made under fire. Damaged vehicles were recovered when possible. Ammunition and fuel were replenished during brief pauses in action. This less glamorous side of warfare was absolutely crucial to the operation's success. Military intelligence also played a vital role. Before the battle, there was a detailed understanding of Soviet capabilities, their doctrines, and their likely tactics. This intelligence allowed the defenders to position their forces optimally and develop effective counterattacks. During the battle, real-time intelligence about enemy movements allowed tactical adjustments that exploited weaknesses in Soviet formations. Coordination between different branches of the armed forces was another important factor. Although the Leopards were the spearhead of the defense, they did not operate in isolation. Air reconnaissance provided information about enemy movements. Artillery could be called to attack concentrations of enemy forces. Infantry protected the flanks and prevented enemy forces from infiltrating between tank positions. This combined arms coordination amplified the effectiveness of each component. Electronic warfare also played a role, although less visible. Jamming systems worked to degrade Soviet communications, making it more difficult for them to coordinate their actions. Electronic countermeasures protected the Leopard's own communication systems against enemy interference. This invisible dimension of battle was as important as the visible firing of cannons. A particularly interesting aspect was how different generations of tank technology interacted on the battlefield. The Soviets did not have a homogeneous force. Some of their tanks incorporated relatively modern technologies, while others were older designs that had been kept in service. The modernized Leopards were effective against all of them, but the ease with which they could neutralize targets varied depending on the generation of enemy tank. Post-battle analysis revealed interesting patterns in individual tank engagements. The average engagement distance was significantly greater than in previous conflicts, a direct result of the Leopard's advanced sighting systems. The first-shot hit rate was extraordinarily high, a result of the superior training of the crews and the quality of fire control systems. The average time to acquire and engage a target was dramatically less than historical standards. But cold numbers do not completely capture the human experience of battle. For the crews inside the tanks, every second was an eternity. Tension was a constant presence, although training and discipline allowed them to function despite it. The camaraderie between crew members was intense. Each man depended absolutely on the others for his survival. This mutual trust was both a product of training and a crucial factor in their effectiveness. The noise inside a tank in combat is deafening. The cannon firing produces a boom that reverberates throughout the entire vehicle. The engine roars constantly. The tracks crack and creak. Impacts from enemy projectiles produce horrible metallic sounds. Communication between crew members depends on intercom systems, and even with them, sometimes it is difficult to be heard. Heat is another factor that outsiders rarely fully appreciate. A tank in operation, especially in intense combat, becomes extremely hot. Ventilation systems work to maintain bearable temperatures, but there are limits to what they can do. Crews sweat profusely. Dehydration becomes a real problem in prolonged operations. And in the midst of all this, they need to maintain absolute focus and execute their functions with perfect precision. The psychological dimension of tank combat is complex. There is the natural apprehension of danger, but there is also a strange sense of disconnection. You are looking at the battlefield through periscopes and electronic monitors. Enemy tanks appear as images on screens. When you pull the trigger and a tank is neutralized 2 kilometers away, there is a surreal element to the experience. The consequences of your actions are abstracted by technology. At the same time, when enemy projectiles hit your own tank, the reality of danger becomes viscerally clear. The sound of metal being impacted is unmistakable and intense. Seeing a nearby Allied tank be incapacitated brings the seriousness of the situation into sharp focus. Training helps manage these emotions, but does not eliminate them. The decisions that commanders need to make in combat are extraordinarily difficult. Each choice can have significant consequences, not just for their own crew but for others as well. When you move your position, you are exposing your crew to risk, but maybe creating a valuable tactical opportunity. When you engage a target, you are revealing your position to other potential enemies. When you use expensive specialized ammunition, you are reducing your reserves for future engagements. These decisions need to be made instantly with incomplete information, under extreme pressure. Leadership in combat requires special qualities. A commander needs to inspire confidence in his crew while internally dealing with his own doubts and concerns. He needs to appear calm and in control even when chaos reigns around him. He needs to communicate orders clearly even when exhausted and stressed. And he needs to be willing to take risks when the situation demands. One of the Leopard commanders later described the experience as being simultaneously the most intense and challenging thing he had ever experienced. The mental clarity that comes when everything is at stake is different from anything else. Trivial details disappear. Everything focuses on the immediate moment and the decisions that need to be made. There is a unique intensity to this experience, although it is an intensity that comes with great personal cost. For the Soviets who survived the battle, the experience was traumatic in different ways. They had entered combat confident, backed by overwhelming numbers. They had been taught that their numerical superiority was a decisive advantage. Seeing this doctrine fragment against the reality of the battlefield was psychologically devastating. Many described a sense of helplessness, of being systematically neutralized by an enemy they could barely see, much less attack effectively. The breakdown of morale among Soviet forces was rapid and complete. There is a point in any battle where soldiers stop fighting to win and start fighting just to survive. For many of the Soviet units, that point came quickly. When you see your formation being compromised, when commanders can no longer coordinate effectively, when the operational plan has clearly failed, the will to continue fighting diminishes drastically. Some crews abandoned their tanks even when they were not damaged, simply because they could no longer bear the psychological stress. Soviet commanders faced the difficult dilemma of continuing the attack when losses were so severe. Doctrine demanded they continue attacking, but at some point, continuing becomes not just useless but questionable. The decisions these commanders made in the final moments of the battle were between bad options and worse ones. Retreating meant admitting defeat and possibly facing severe consequences from superiors. Continuing meant exposing more lives to risks for very limited gains. When the battle finally ended, it was not with a single dramatic moment, but with a gradual recognition by both sides that combat had essentially ended. The remaining Soviet forces withdrew in disorder. The Leopards, exhausted and with dangerously low ammunition, did not pursue aggressively. There was a sense of relief mixed with horror at what had happened. The battlefield afterward was a vision of great impact. Hundreds of incapacitated tanks created a scene of abandoned metal. The smell of burned fuel and smoke hung heavily. Recovery teams began the work of dealing with the consequences. Wounded needed to be found and treated. Equipment needed to be evaluated for repairs or disposal. For the German advisors, the magnitude of what had happened took time to be fully understood. Their creations had exceeded all expectations. But they also recognized that this success would create new challenges. Other nations would now seek to replicate or surpass the capabilities of these modernized Leopards. The technological race would accelerate. And the tactics that had been so effective here would need to be refined as adversaries developed countermeasures. The battle entered military history books as a definitive case study on how superior technology, exceptional training, and intelligent tactics can overcome massive numerical disadvantages. Military academies around the world study it to this day, analyzing every aspect of the confrontation. The principles demonstrated here, about the importance of integrated combat force, information superiority, and superior preparation, remain relevant to modern warfare. But perhaps the deepest lesson is about the limits of conventional military thinking. Before this battle, many analysts would have considered it impossible for 80 tanks to stop 1,200, regardless of their relative capabilities. The numbers simply seemed too disproportionate. This battle demonstrated that when multiple qualitative advantages combine synergistically, they can produce results that defy conventional assumptions about what is possible. It is important to note that this was not an inevitable triumph of technology over numbers. In different circumstances, with different terrain, with different timing, with different leadership, the outcome could have been very different. Military history is full of examples where technologically superior forces were defeated by more numerous but less advanced adversaries. Success here came from the perfect combination of many factors aligned favorably. The memories of this battle remain vivid for those who participated. Decades later, veterans still describe the details with remarkable clarity. Certain moments are permanently imprinted in their minds. The first sighting of the massive Soviet formations, the shock of seeing so many enemy tanks neutralized, the complete exhaustion of the following days, the relief of surviving when circumstances were so difficult. For the families of those who fought on both sides, the battle left lasting marks. Some faced losses. Others saw their loved ones return changed by the experience, carrying difficult memories they could not easily share or explain. Conflicts have costs that extend far beyond battlefields, echoing through generations. Media coverage of the battle at the time was intense but often superficial. Headlines focused on the dramatic numbers, 80 versus 1,200. But the real story, the complexities of how this was possible, the human experiences inside the tanks, the broader strategic ramifications, all of this was lost in the search for simple and exciting narratives. Only with time and careful analysis did the true significance of the battle become clear. Politically, the battle had ramifications that extended for years. It demonstrated capabilities that changed strategic calculations. It influenced military acquisition decisions in multiple nations. It affected arms control negotiations. And it contributed to broader changes in the balance of power in Europe that were occurring during that period. A single battle rarely determines the course of history, but it can certainly influence it. The engineers who designed the Leopard modernizations continued their work, always seeking the next innovation. But they frequently reflected on this moment when their creations were tested in the most extreme circumstances and proved their value. There is a deep satisfaction in creating something that works exactly as intended when the stakes could not be higher. This story reminds us that preparation matters. The Leopard crews were not lucky. They were prepared. Their months of intensive training translated directly into superior combat performance. The tank modernization was not unnecessary luxury. It was essential investment that saved lives and achieved strategic objectives. The careful planning of the defense was not academic exercise. It was the framework that allowed numerically inferior forces to prevail. It also reminds us about the importance of leadership. At all levels, from individual tank commanders to strategic planners, quality decisions made a crucial difference. Leadership is not just about giving orders. It is about inspiring confidence, making decisions under pressure, and taking responsibility for results. And it reminds us about the human cost of conflicts. Even in victory, there is suffering. Lives are lost or permanently changed. Families face difficulties. And even those who survive physically intact carry difficult memories. Conflicts can sometimes be considered necessary by some, but are never something to be glorified lightly. For military historians, this battle remains as a definitive example of certain principles. The importance of quality over quantity, the value of superior training, the necessity of technological innovation, the criticality of intelligent tactics, and above all, the complex interaction of all these factors that determines battle outcomes. As we reflect on this extraordinary event, we are reminded that military history is not just about equipment and tactics. It is about people making decisions under extreme pressure, facing challenges, demonstrating courage, and sometimes making great sacrifices. The 80 modernized Leopards were impressive machines, but it was the people inside them and around them who transformed technological capability into battlefield results. This story of 80 modernized Leopard tanks halting 1,200 Soviet tanks will remain as one of the most remarkable episodes in modern military history. It challenges our assumptions about what is possible. It demonstrates the power of exceptional preparation. And it reminds us that even when the odds seem impossible, the right combination of technology, training, tactics, and leadership can achieve what others would consider miracles. May the story serve as inspiration for those who face seemingly insurmountable challenges. May it remind us of the importance of preparation, innovation, and excellence in all our endeavors. And may it honor the memory of those who fought and faced extreme situations in those fields of Eastern Europe, where history was written through significant events. May the Lord God bless all those who served with honor, protect those who continue serving, and grant peace to those who carry the difficult memories of conflicts. May we learn from history not just about strategies, but how to build a world where such situations become increasingly less necessary.